A teammate's concern, a car destroyed from the inside, a secret discovered in silence, and a revelation that could change Ferrari's season forever. Because after Singapore, Charles Leclerc walked into Hamilton's garage, looked at the car, and found something no one expected. Ferrari's night in Singapore ended not with the roar of engines, but with the sound of realization. What Charles Leclerc had found wasn't just damage, it was diagnosis. The SF-25's cooling system, designed to function as an aerodynamic masterpiece, had turned into a liability. When he traced his gloved finger across the warped surface of Hamilton's brake duct, he had unknowingly uncovered the car's greatest weakness, its inability to survive its own perfection. The team had engineered a system so focused on efficiency that it forgot endurance. Inside the Ferrari garage, the mood shifted from confusion to shock. Engineers huddled around laptops, rerunning data that had looked flawless only hours earlier. Nothing in the telemetry suggested a collapse. The airflow graphs were smooth, the pressure readings stable, and yet the physical evidence in front of them was undeniable. The left-hand duct had buckled from internal pressure, trapping heat and starving the brakes of cooling air. The carbon hadn't failed because it was weak, it failed because the design gave it no margin for error. The SF-25 was living proof that precision without forgiveness is fragility. Hamilton had been the first to sense it. His radio messages throughout the weekend had been calm but consistent. "Feels soft on the front," he said on Friday. "It's breathing wrong," he repeated on Saturday. During the race, he could feel the thermal buildup through the pedal, a faint pulse that told him the brakes were on the edge. When the pedal finally dropped to floor, it didn't surprise him. What shocked him was that the team hadn't seen it coming. He had felt the system deteriorating hours before the sensors caught up. And now, Leclerc's discovery proved he was right. The failure hadn't started with the race, it had started with the concept. Fred Vasseur faced the uncomfortable truth immediately. The SF-25 wasn't just suffering from bad luck or a single malfunction. It was structurally unbalanced. The cooling distribution between the left and right sides of the car was uneven, caused by asymmetrical duct geometry integrated into the front suspension design. The airflow patterns that looked so elegant in the wind tunnel had turned unpredictable in real-world conditions. In slow-speed corners like those in Singapore, where air pressure drops sharply, the systems simply ran out of breath. It was a design born from ambition, executed with precision, and doomed by physics. For Leclerc, the realization was equally sobering. The same issue could have struck his car at any moment. During his own race, he had noticed rising brake temperatures and inconsistent response, but he had assumed it was the humidity or debris. Now he knew better. His car had been a lap or two away from the same collapse that had taken Hamilton out. The difference between the two Ferraris had been a few degrees of luck. He stood beside his teammate's car long after the inspection ended, staring at the melted duct, understanding what it meant. Ferrari's problem wasn't speed or strategy. It was trust in their own perfection. What Ferrari discovered in the hours after Singapore was a paradox. The SF-25 was too advanced for its own stability. In the pursuit of aerodynamic purity, the team had pushed its thermal systems to the very edge of physical tolerance. The ducts, calipers, and suspension geometry were all integrated into a single aerodynamic philosophy. It looked stunning in design renders and wind tunnel models, but in the real world of Marina Bay, where air density, humidity, and traffic constantly shift, that same precision became fragility. The SF-25 wasn't overheating because something broke. It was overheating because it was doing exactly what it had been designed to do, trapping airflow to generate downforce. The deeper the engineers looked, the worse it got. When they scanned the car's front left assembly with thermal imaging cameras, the results were shocking. The duct temperatures had exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, enough to deform the carbon's molecular structure. The inner wall of the brake housing had blistered inward, effectively sealing itself off. The data that had shown stable airflow during the race was based on an assumption that the duct retained its shape. In reality, it had warped mid-race, turning the car's most vital cooling pathway into an oven. Ferrari had built a car that was cooking itself alive. Leclerc's discovery had been the key. He noticed that the pattern of damage wasn't random. The deformation followed the aerodynamic contour lines, meaning the pressure distribution was uneven from the very start. The left side of the car generated slightly more downforce due to its suspension angle, redirecting airflow away from the duct. It was a minute asymmetry, invisible in simulation but devastating in motion. The engineers confirmed it through airflow reconstruction tests. At speeds below 140 kilometers per hour, the left-hand brake duct was losing more than 40% of its cooling efficiency. Singapore, with its low-speed corners and heavy braking zones, had simply exposed the flaw in full daylight. Fred Vasseur's reaction was immediate and clinical. He knew this wasn't a fixable problem in setup, it was structural. The brake ducts were part of the chassis architecture. Changing them meant redesigning sections of the car. But what shocked him most was how the drivers had sensed it before the systems did. Hamilton had been right when he said the car was breathing wrong. Leclerc had been right when he said, "That's not from braking." Both men had detected, through instinct alone, what the sensors and simulations had missed. It wasn't just an engineering flaw. It was a failure of belief in human perception. Inside Ferrari's engineering office that night, the discussion shifted from analysis to accountability. One aerodynamicist admitted that the cooling margins had been cut deliberately to gain downforce efficiency, believing the brake-by-wire software would manage the excess heat. It worked on cooler tracks like Silverstone and Spa, but in Singapore's 40-degree humidity, the system collapsed. The very concept that made the car fast made it fragile. In the heat of competition, Ferrari's innovation had crossed a line. What Leclerc and Hamilton had exposed was more than a technical issue, it was a philosophical one. Ferrari had built a car that depended entirely on mathematical control, a machine that left no space for imperfection. But Formula One doesn't forgive extremes. Cars need margin, just as teams need humility. The SF-25 had neither. The engineers realized that the car's greatest strength, its obsessive integration of systems, was also its fatal weakness. Every improvement came with an unseen cost, and in Singapore, that cost had finally come due. When the post-race analysis began, the Ferrari garage no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a courtroom. The SF-25, stripped down and silent under the white lights, was the defendant. The data screens on the wall were its witnesses. Fred Vasseur stood at the center, arms crossed, watching his engineers explain the collapse in the language of numbers, graphs, airflow projections, heat maps. But every explanation circled back to one truth no one wanted to say out loud. The car had failed because the team had trusted mathematics more than men. Leclerc, still in his race suit, stood beside the scorched carbon duct he'd discovered. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "This," he said, tapping the warped surface, "is not a random failure. This is design." Hamilton, sitting quietly in a chair behind him, didn't need to speak. His expression said enough. He had felt that flaw long before anyone could measure it. In that instant, the two drivers, so different in style and temperament, stood on the same side of truth. The engineers, for all their models and simulations, had been outperformed by human instinct. Vasseur broke the silence. "We'll rebuild the cooling system," he said. But it wasn't a technical order, it was a symbolic one. He was no longer talking about ducts and temperature. He was talking about Ferrari itself. He realized that the real problem wasn't the car's design, it was the team's culture. Ferrari had become addicted to certainty, to the illusion that precision guaranteed control. But Formula One, Hamilton reminded him later that evening, doesn't work like that. "Sometimes you have to feel the limit," Hamilton said, "not just measure it." For a moment, the room shifted. Engineers who had spent years speaking only in data began to listen differently. They re-examined every chart, every airflow model, not to defend them, but to question them. The turning point wasn't a discovery in software or simulation. It was the reintroduction of humility. Leclerc's eye and Hamilton's intuition had done what no algorithm could. They had forced Ferrari to rediscover its humanity. That night, Ferrari began an internal audit of every component on the SF-25, but this time the approach was new. The driver's feedback became the baseline, and the data had to follow it, not the other way around. Vasseur ordered the engineering department to integrate driver sensitivity models into the simulation algorithms, effectively turning Hamilton and Leclerc's on-track instincts into quantifiable parameters. It was a revolution inside Maranello, a rebalancing of man and machine. As dawn broke over Singapore, the Ferrari garage was still lit, the red cars stripped bare. Hamilton and Leclerc walked out together, silent, exhausted, but united by an unspoken understanding. Between them, they had turned disaster into direction. They had reminded Ferrari that progress in Formula One isn't just measured in numbers, but in the courage to trust the people who feel the machine's truth before the sensors ever can. For Fred Vasseur, that night was more than a lesson. It was a confession written in carbon and heat. The SF-25's failure wasn't a defeat. It was a mirror, showing him exactly what Ferrari had forgotten.